Okay, I'm glad to be back with you guys. We're starting week 3. And what I'm going to do with this first lecture is to just sort of finish up what we started with week 2, and where we were going and looking at specific kind of genres for applying these principles that we've been learning, and just sort of letting you see some specific ways we can apply that. Well, we're going to finish up with the epistles. The epistles are very important for us to look at specifically because if you think about it, in your New Testament, it's mostly epistles. And so that's going to be a big part of what you're looking at. It's also what you're doing for your exegetical paper. And so anyway, we want to spend just a little time on the epistles to kind of complement your reading and be able to look at some of those ways that you might be able to apply what you've been learning in your reading with this category of biblical literature called the epistles. Now, epistle just means letter. That's what that means. And so let me let me talk to you about two different categories that we have for epistles. We have one category. It's the first 13 epistles that we have in the New Testament. They're all written by Paul, and we call those the real letters. Now, we don't mean to insinuate that Paul's letters are real epistles and the rest of them are just phony epistles. That's not it at all. What we mean by real epistles is that the intention of the writer was to write a real letter to a particular person or audience. It was an actual letter, and so that's kind of what that designation means. Now, we have a second category that is called the general epistle, or alternatively, another way to call that same category, another way that it's referred to is called the Catholic letters. So general epistles, Catholic letters is that second category. And when we say Catholic, we mean universal. Okay, so that's what that means. What's the difference? It's due to the fact this category being there is due to the fact that these letters were prepared and written not just for a particular audience, but the church in general. So you kind of see where that universal theme or that general theme comes in with that designation in that category. So those are the two different kinds of epistles that you find in your New Testament. Quite a lot of your New Testament is made up of one of these two kinds of epistles. Now, an epistle, as I said, is a letter. It represents a kind of ancient letter form, okay, or structure. There's different categories of, or elements, you might say, that make up an ancient letter form. You've got 1, the name of the writer will be included. 2, you've got the name of the recipient. 3, the greeting. 4, you've got a prayer, some sort of thanksgiving. 5, you've got the body of the letter itself. And 6, you have a kind of farewell. Now, the last 8 epistles, these Catholic or general epistles that we spoke about, are considered distinct from the Pauline epistles, or what we call the real letters, for a couple of reasons. But one reason is because they lack one or several of these key elements that we find in ancient letter form. And so now you can kind of see what we're talking about when we designate these two kinds of epistles. Something else that's very important, and this is true about the epistles generally, okay, is that there are what we call occasional documents. They're occasional documents. I don't mean to say that Paul just occasionally wrote a letter. No. There is some occasion for why these letters were written. There's some occasion for it. They have this in common. There was something that prompted, some situation that prompted the writing of the document. This is something that we're able to determine most of the time, and it's very helpful information for us to be able to determine to help us understand what we're reading. This is some really important information. If you knew what was going on, what the reason was for this letter having been written, then that would make a lot of sense. Some of the things that Paul or John or Peter were saying would all of a sudden make a lot of sense. Now, this is not always readily available to you. Sometimes you can just determine just from reading the book itself. In the Bible, it lets the occasion be known in that setting. Sometimes we have to do some historical research. We get our good commentaries, New Testament introductions, Bible dictionaries, and so forth to give us that sort of information. But one example of one that maybe not as, like Hebrews, for example, sometimes it gives people trouble when we're trying to figure out what the occasion was. We do know certain things. We have some clues. It was instruction written to Jewish Christians and their struggles to reconcile their Jewish heritage and so on. So we know some of these things, but there's certain historical elements that and details that we just don't know about. That's one example. But whatever we can know, we need to try to know. Because if we don't know any of those things, it's kind of like hearing a phone conversation, but only one side of the conversation. You can kind of catch on to what's going on, But the more that we background information we have, the more helpful it'll be for us to get to the bottom of things. And but luckily, most of the time, these things are sometimes very obvious in the text, and something that if we give a careful reading to the document, we can put the pieces of the puzzle together that way as well. Okay, so they're occasional documents, and it's very important for us to remember that. Now, one thing related to this idea that they're occasional documents, one conclusion that we can make is that these documents are not theological textbooks, okay? They're not theological textbooks. You don't want to try to build an entire systematic theology based on the book of Romans, okay? You're not going to be very successful. Your theology is going to be missing some things. It's going to emphasize some things that shouldn't be emphasized, or whatever. Romans, Ephesians. What the point is that if you pick an epistle, you have to realize these are occasional documents. In other words, the writer didn't expound an exhaustive theology. He didn't try to tell those readers from start to finish, from A to Z, what his theology was about everything, right? He was specifically addressing a situation, an occasion, okay? And he was letting us know some of his theology as it pertains to that occasion, okay? So it's not a complete or exhaustive theology, just a helpful reminder as you're kind of going through and working through the interpretation of these epistles. All right, now let's think about the exegesis of epistles. Okay? Now, exegesis is really that step one that you've been reading about in your textbook. The technical term for that is exegesis. That's where we try to get to the original meaning, what the author meant and intended when he wrote it. When we're doing that, we're doing exegesis. That's the reason why your paper that you're going to be writing is called an exegetical paper, right? That's primarily what you're focusing on with that paper. You're trying to do the exegetical work, okay? And that's the step one in your textbook that you've been reading about. Well, let's think about some elements related to exegesis. One is historical context. This is nothing new or unique about trying to understand epistles, okay? Historical context is a big deal no matter what you're trying to interpret. We already know that. We've already talked about the importance of historical context, but I just wanted to bring it up again and let you know that we just got finished talking about the occasion that the document is written. Well, that's historical context, okay? That and some other items as well. And so don't forget that. That's a key part of doing the exegetical work and trying to figure out what the original writer intended when he wrote that. Another context, we're still in step one of your that your textbook author describes, what I'm calling exegesis. You don't want to forget the literary context, okay? This is really where you get serious about what's right in front of you, okay? This is where you sort of begin to analyze the language itself. You will begin to trace the author's meaning. Words make up sentences, and sentences make up paragraphs, and so on and so forth. You can begin to see how that all fits together. Okay, so the kinds of observations that you make about a text, very much like the assignments that you've been doing most recently, where you have a text of Scripture, and you're piecing it all together. You're making observations, different parts of speech. This goes with here. There's repetition here, so on and so forth. Those assignments that you've been doing, a lot of what you're doing there has to do with what we're calling literary context. You're analyzing the language here, okay? You're looking at the words, and you're looking at those words in sentences, and you're looking at those sentences in paragraphs and so forth. So you've done the historical context, that work. Now you're really focusing on the language, that literary context, okay? You're also not only looking at the grammar, but one of your assignments had to do with sort of making an outline, right, of the whole book. Well, this is also part of the literary context because you're sort of going through and looking at where your passage, that theme break, fits in with the rest of the theme breaks. Okay, now someone has asked me, so well, shouldn't I just maybe observe the chapter divisions, or maybe the publisher provides some headings over paragraphs, and is that what I'm supposed to look at? Well, some of those things could be helpful, no doubt, but the chapter and verse divisions in your Bible, there's nothing inspired about those, okay? Those, and very often we just think that they're wrong. Okay, that's not the Apostle Paul's fault. He didn't put those in there. Somebody did that a long time later. So there's nothing sacred about those chapter and verse divisions. So you're going to read through there. Sometimes the theme break is going to occur right after a new chapter starts. That's just a reality. You need to be able to read through that and make those decisions for yourself about where does this theme start, this new theme that Paul or Peter is talking about, and where does it end, and so forth, when you're making an outline in that way. Sometimes the headings that the publisher will put in will be helpful, but you just need to look at it and analyze that for yourself. Also, the commentators in these commentaries, they're making those kind of structural and theme observations and divisions themselves. So you want to look at several of those and see what you think about the decisions they've made and compare that to your thoughts as well. So this is all the kind of work that you do whenever you're thinking about literary context with the epistles. You know, with the Psalms, it's easy. What's the theme break? It's the whole psalm, okay? You know, I mean, that's your unit, right? That's your unit. Well, with the epistles, it's a little bit more difficult because you have to sort of find that in this whole letter. And but anyway, so I encourage you to continue to practice that, and those assignments hopefully have been helpful to you in that way. Now we're going to skip over to step 3, what your textbook writer calls step 3 in the interpretive process. That's what we're calling the theological task, okay? So I just wanted to spend a moment about that. After you've done the exegetical work, you do that first. Then you start to think about the theological task. You ask yourself, what's true about this passage, regardless of any sort of context? Because, you know, there's going to be something timeless about the passage that you're reading that's not bound in history, okay? If you were to read Philippians 2:12 through 18, you might pause the video and take a look at that. But if you read through that, you can do all the exegetical work that we talked about. You can study about the historical background of the book in general. You can analyze the language, the literary context of the passage itself. And then perhaps then you could make a theological assertion after all of that, and that is true no matter what the context is. One like, for instance, you could say salvation is not just a past event, but also is progressive and ongoing in the lives of Christians. I'm supposing or suggesting that you could make this observation about Philippians 2:12 through 18, and that's something that's true regardless of the context. Now, I needed to do all the context work to get to the exegetical truth of it, what it meant by the original writer, but there's certain truths or themes that come out of what Paul said that's not bound in history at all whatsoever, not bound in any sort of context. That's true then, in the same way that it was true now and in the future, and so on and so forth. In other words, there's no historical elements that that need us to stop and think, now this is going to be a little different because of this contextual situation. In other words, if you're looking at 1 Corinthians and Paul's talking about meat sacrificed to idols, all right? It's not that that's unimportant. It's just that we don't really, that's not a big deal for us, right? We don't have a bunch of churches having meetings about whether or not we should be eating meat sacrificed to idols, right? But there's some sort of universal truth in that passage, right? So we understand that that's what's going on there, and we learn everything we can about that. It helps us to make an analogy to something that may be going on right now in the life of the church. That is true right now, and that theme is universal. It was true then when you relate it to meat sacrificed to idols. It's true now when you relate it to some other thing, perhaps maybe alcohol or some other topic that might be more of a concern for the church today. Okay, and so that's what I'm talking about when we talk about the theological task. So there you go. So there's a couple of things related to the exegetical work of the passage, the theological task, and something else that you want to think about is the application part, okay? The application part, which I guess would end up being step 5 of the interpretive process for your textbook reading. Now, remember the application, that's the part when we ask the question, how do we apply the meaning of this text in the here and now? Obviously, this is very important because if we don't ask that question, then why have we been doing all of this anyway? The problem is that people usually just jump to that part. They just say, well, how can I apply this to here? No, they start there. And because it's the most practical question out of all the questions, right? But you can see how perhaps some of your conclusions would just be inaccurate if you start there without having done some of this other work before it. So that's the reason why we encourage you guys to do all these sorts of things. I want to talk to you about some rules or some principles that you can go by whenever you're trying to make application, okay? Rule number 1, let's say. Rule number 1. Whenever you're trying to make application, something that you want to keep in mind, just some principles, some guiding principles for you. Hopefully this will go along and help you with your, in other words, sort of add to what you've been reading, a complementary sort of set of ideas here. Rule number one, when you're trying to make application, the text can never mean what it never meant. The text can never mean what it never meant. So the text cannot take on a new meaning in the here and now, okay? A new meaning in the here and now that would not have been theoretically possible in the first century. This is something you want to remember when you're making application, okay? Let me give you one good example. 1 Corinthians 13:10, if you want to take a look at that. There's a particular point of view, and don't get hung up on this. It's just an example, so don't get hung up on the terminology here. But there's a particular theory called cessationism, which believes that certain gifts of the Holy Spirit, like speaking in tongues, prophecy, that what we call the sensational gifts, are no longer operative today. You may have heard that, but there's always a name for these things. Cessationism, okay? Well, anyway, my point is that one very popular passage for proving this is found in 1 Corinthians 13:10. Let me just read it to you. It says, "But when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away." Okay? So, regardless of whether or not you believe in cessationism, that's not my point here. Some of you students may, some of you students may not. That's not my point. My point is that this passage, I'm arguing, is not a very good example of a verse that would prove this. Why? Why am I saying that? Because the New Testament did not exist in its present form at that time, okay? And so it couldn't possibly mean what we're saying that it means now back then, okay? Right? We're saying the New Testament is here in its canonized form. That's the perfect. So these other sensational gifts simply aren't needed anymore, okay? That's not theoretically possible for this passage when it was written. Therefore, I'm proposing that that's not a legitimate interpretation of this verse in the here and now. Regardless of whether you believe in cessationism, I just think that you need to go to some other passages if that's your perspective. That's just one example. So rule number one, the text can never mean what it never meant. Another rule, whenever we have comparable life situations to the biblical text, okay, our application in the here and now should be the same as the first century Christians. So don't get me wrong. You know, sometimes, even way back then, what was going on with them is just like what's going on with us, okay? And sometimes that happens, and when that happens, then the application is identical, okay? There's like nothing really much at all to do to make application. Your application is very simple in those situations, okay? So that's something to remember. Rule number three, whenever the Bible speaks of particulars, okay? In other words, attending idol feasts, like in 1 Corinthians 8, or Paul having the right as an apostle to receive pay. We see that in chapter 9 of that same book. Anyway, so when we have those kinds of particulars being spoke of that do not correspond to the 21st century, then we try to ascertain basic principles being taught and avoid applying that principle randomly and in ways that are only in comparable situations, okay? And so whenever some of these things are not exactly what's going on in the here and now, we just talked about that a minute ago, then we're very careful to not apply these principles randomly and only in those situations that are comparable, okay? A true analogous situation there, okay? So that's another rule for you. What about the idea of cultural relevance? That's a big sort of buzz topic today whenever we're talking about the Bible and its meaning and so forth. Let me just say a couple of words about that. First of all, there's no such thing as an ordained culture, okay? No such thing. Western culture is not ordained by God in a way that other cultures are not. We have things that are wrong with our culture and things that are good about it, just like other cultures do as well. So keep that in mind, all right? Another thing is that we must learn to distinguish if the Bible is being prescriptive or descriptive. This is related to culture and our dealing with the Bible, okay? When we're reading something, is the Bible telling us this is how it should be done, prescriptive, okay? Or when we're reading it, is the Bible telling us this is what happened, okay? That's descriptive. And we need to know the difference because one we need to do, the other one we need to take note of, okay? For instance, Paul has what we call a sin list. He lists off a series of things that are wrong, things that should be avoided on the part of the Christian in the Christian life. It's in 1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 10. This is an example of prescription. The Bible's telling us we should not do this. Okay, these things are not good. They do not bring us into into a situation where we're being conformed into the image of Christ. Don't do it. It's prescriptive, okay? So that's an example of what I'm talking about there. Now, however, we do have Paul also discussing what we call head coverings for women in 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through 6. This seems to be something descriptive, and you see how this relates to culture, because in Western culture, women don't wear head coverings. So you're asking the question, how is this culturally relevant to now, and so on and so forth? Well, anyway, we believe this is more of a descriptive type situation. 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through 16. Paul, if you notice, and if you read there, is appealing to a cultural norm. He's appealing to this cultural norm in order to make a spiritual point, right? It's something that he's using to make a point. He's drawing from his culture to make some spiritual point about something else. And so the bit about the head covering is not prescriptive, it's descriptive. And so in this culture, where we don't have ladies in Western culture wearing head coverings, we don't have to feel the burden of that passage being prescriptive for us. Okay, we take note of it and we acknowledge it, and we recognize the spiritual point that Paul is making, and we make an application in that way. Well, guys, these are just a few things related to the epistles. Some of these things can broaden out and relate to other types of genre as well. But I wanted to give you that lecture, and I hope this was helpful. You guys are doing great. Keep up the good work. We'll talk to you later.